Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with CASS Sunstein presenting his new book, Sludge, What Stops Us from Getting Things Done and What to Do About It, joined in conversation by Cait Lamberton. Thank you for joining us tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Sludge on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. And we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. CASS SUNSTEIN is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law, the chair of the Technical Advisory Group on Behavioral Insights and Sciences at the World Health Organization, and a senior advisor to the Department of Homeland Security. He was the founder and director of Harvard Law's program on behavioral economics and public policy, as well as the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the first Obama administration. He's also been an attorney advisor in the Office of the Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice. Professor Sunstein is also the author of many books, including, but by no means limited to, This Is Not Normal, The Politics of Everyday Expectations, Conformity, The Power of Social Influences, and Nudge, Improving Decisions about Health, Wealth, and Happiness. Tonight, Professor Sunstein will be joined in conversation by Cait Lamberton, Distinguished Professor of Marketing at Wharton. These two will be discussing Professor Sunstein's latest book, Sludge, which Pamela Hurd, Georgetown Professor of Public Affairs, called eminently readable and important, and required reading for anyone interested in public policy. And Education Next said that in Sludge, Sunstein shines a light in the bureaucratic darkness, and by calling for sludge audits, adds his moral authority to the growing demand to clear out the bureaucratic underbrush. We're so happy to have them here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Professor Lamberton and Professor Sunstein.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Well, first, Cass, I want to say congratulations on the book. And I agree that it is eminently readable, truly is. And I wanted to start out, what a time to be writing about sludge, right? And one of the points that I think you make really nicely in the book is that the pandemic has made very clear to us what the potential costs of sludge are. And I personally have been kind of amazed at how sludge-free some really important processes have been during that time. But I wondered when I was reading that, given your decades of experience in policy, have there been other experiences, occasions, phenomena where you think people became acutely aware of sludge and its potential costs?
Well, there's individuals and then there's groups. So individuals who have, let's say, a medical problem might find that there's a lot of sludge they have to navigate to get some help. I was discussing sludge at the early stages of the book with some students at a distinguished university, I won't name it, and I asked them what sludge have they encountered. It was a group of about 6. And 2 of them said they had mental health issues, not horrible, but not good. And they said they tried to get help through the university's medical facility. And they said what they had to do was really depressing and anxiety producing. And they decided, since one was dealing with depression and the other with anxiety, they didn't want to navigate the sludge that the university's medical facilities put before them. So that was at the individual level. I think some people dealing with companies, whether it's buying a house or selling a house or buying a car or selling a car, encounter a great deal of sludge from state and local government sometimes from the federal government. There are all these forms that you have to fill out. One thing that created a movement, which eventually came to fruition, and now we're going from individuals to groups, is the FAFSA form, the financial aid form, where individuals have found, students and parents, that the form, which used to have well over 100 questions, it's really hard to navigate, would often discourage poor families from even trying. And that's both in a way, it could be the stuff of comedy easily, but it's also tragedy because there are people who are trying to get to university, and maybe the sludge is a wall that separates them from something to which they have a legal right. And that became a kind of movement where I'm not sure how organized it was, but it was a movement which produced bipartisan legislation recently.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I saw that the last few years, some portions of the form are now even pre-filled from prior year's taxes, right? Which is a huge advantage.
Completely. So pre-filling forms is a sludge busting strategy. Some of us have sometimes benefited from it. And if you have no idea what the answers to the questions are, but the person who's filling out the form actually can find out like that, either because the private institution or the government has it, that can be a mercy.
Yeah, I think that these cases that you raise are particularly moving. They make me want to know more about sludge because they are reducing who has a number of advanced degrees, and she says, I'm not even going to bother with the FAFSA, it's not worth it. It's quite another thing if you have a Pell eligible family that's losing access to those resources. And so another thing that occurred to me as I was reading that it seems like some of our sludge busting has been more effective for people who already have more privilege, right? So I'm a huge fan of TSA PreCheck. Like, I think it's the best thing. Well, not the best thing, a truly great thing, right? But I also recognize that to even qualify for that step out of the sludge pile, you have to have time. You have to be able to go and do this interview, and you have to have 100 extra bucks, and you need to be able to substantiate your living situation, right? So I wondered if you see any connection between our vulnerability to sludge and, I'm not sure, social status, level of privilege.
It's a great question. So if the relevant institution, let's call it the University of California or the state of California, says, we'll take the sludge away if you give us $500, then a lot of people will get the sludge removed, depending on how bad it is, but they might not be the people who it's especially important to have the sludge removed. So, and you can probably see all over, this is a great research project as well as a practical one, where if you have some money, you can buy your way out of administrative burdens and frictions. And that's, there might be a serious fairness problem there. So let's separate TSA Pre, which is increasingly, I think, easy and simple, from something like the only government program, I confess, that I have a hard time talking about without crying. So I'm gonna try to make my way through this one. And the program involves a problem where the problem is that poor children in the United States are entitled to free lunches and breakfasts, but to do that, they have to go through sludge in order to enjoy the benefit. And we're talking about kids here who are poor, and for them to have free lunch and breakfast can not only change their day, can change actually their whole life and their family's life. What are we going to do about that? The fact that the parents don't sign up. You could tell the parents, you don't have to fill out the form. If you send us $200, we'll waive the form obligation, but that probably wouldn't work so great because we're talking about poor families that don't have money. And by the way, one reason they might not be filling out the form is they don't have time. They're focused on trying to get through the day. They're scared, there's a government form, or they're baffled by the form. So the program, bear with me for a moment, because we're talking about something whose human consequences are unfathomably large and good. It's called direct certification, and it takes the level of sludge down not by 50%, it takes it down to 0. So the school or the locality can say that we know you're eligible. You don't have to fill out any form. You're in. And the result of that is that 15 million kids in the United States at last count were enjoying free lunches and breakfasts to which they're legally entitled. And 15 million kids, that's a number, but each of that's human children. And if we saw on the screen maybe 12 of their faces, there might not be a dry eye in the house.
Yeah, who are not sitting there hungry, who are not inherently then at a disadvantage for every task they're given that day. Yeah, that's really exciting. And I wonder, maybe I could back up for 1 minute and say, what have you seen in this area that's been most exciting to you? I mean, that's obviously very exciting. Are there other sludge busting efforts that have kind of made you see enormous potential for this?
Yeah, I'll tell you one that I think is potentially really significant, and our places are heterogeneous. Germany, Switzerland, and California. What unifies them? A lot of things, but the one I'm going to underline is they've taken the sludge away from enrollment in green energy. So in Germany, a lot of electricity providers say you're in solar and wind automatically. If you want to be in a dirtier source, go for it. You might save some money. And in Switzerland, we actually know the data is very clear that the automatic enrollment in clean energy, it does cost households, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large businesses. It costs them all real money. They're automatically enrolled, though, in the cleaner energy source. And California, there's something called green by default, which is the same basic idea. And the reason it is powerful is the Switzerland data shows that the greenhouse gas emissions reductions are huge. It's a really good thing from the standpoint of climate. And even if you lowball the monetized benefit of eliminating those greenhouse gas emissions, a low social cost of carbon, as it's called, the benefits crush the costs. It's a spectacular winner. And that suggests that program, which takes the sludge away from getting into clean energy, has been a spectacular winner in terms of every environmental question really that we care about, or at least a significant subset.
Wow, that's a huge, far-reaching impact, right? And so to connect this to some of your prior work, probably a lot of people that are watching this are very familiar with the idea of nudging, right? And so do you ever find yourself kind of comparing the effects of nudging in this direction as opposed to the effects of removing sludge?
Right. So nudge is a large category. It includes all interventions which preserve freedom of choice, but steer people in a particular direction. So calorie labels are a nudge, a reminder by text that you have a doctor's appointment or a bill due. That's a nudge. If you're told something about what the social norm is, most people in your community are getting vaccinated. That's a nudge. If you are warned when you go to the beach that the current is pretty tough and swimming is dangerous, that's a nudge. Sludge is a more particular concept, and you can think of it as the evil twin of nudge. I prefer to think of it as something that is often evil, sometimes good and justified, but very easy to define. That is frictions and administrative burdens, such as paperwork requirements, waiting time, having to go into an office when you could maybe do it at home. The kind of navigation challenge that I recently faced when I tried to change just a tiny bit my relationship to my cell phone company, tried to change it just a tiny bit, and it took hours and I failed. I didn't do it. It's too hard for me. That was not a nudge. That was a lot of friction and sludge.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when you look at, for example, back to your climate change example, you're seeing these massive impacts of removing sludge. And I honestly can't remember, aside from defaults perhaps, examples of nudge interventions that seem to have quite the same level of headline hit in the last few years at least. Seems really like a huge, a hugely impactful kind of step to remove the sludge.
Completely. So here's a statistic for you that in programs that are designed to reduce poverty in the United States, the take-up rate is typically or frequently between 40 and 60%. And I was a literature major, not math major, but even I know if the take-up rate is 40 to 60%, the non-take-up rate is 50%. And that's a scandal.
Yeah.
Meaning these are programs that could really help people tremendously and not benefiting from something. And so I'll give an example. The Earned Income Tax Credit, where the take-up rate, last I checked, is significantly higher than 60%, but significantly south of 90%. So that means a lot of people aren't benefiting from it. That's a really good program for the people and the children who have access to it. If we did something to make it automatic, we'd affect a lot of people like that. And that's true for many programs that have potentially transformative effects on people's lives. If there are permit requirements or licensing requirements that are really hard to get through, it's often the case, and we observe this with occupational licensing, that people can't do work that they've trained at least some well enough to carve out a living, and because of the sludge they don't get through it. If we just monetize the value of time and even have a relatively low number, $20 an hour, the fact that the US government at last count imposed 11 billion annual hours in paperwork requirements on the American people. The monetary equivalent is higher than the budget of many of the large cabinet departments in the United States. That's for paperwork requirements. And as you were signaling with some of the examples you gave, the monetary equivalent of the time, that's really bad. But that's not where sludge bites hardest. Where it bites hardest is it prevents people from having access to something, which could be, something that could make their next year a lot better than their past year.
Yeah, it seems very clear. I mean, of course, you're arguing it in a very clear, reasons, compelling way. Why isn't this fixed? I mean, so I'm sure you talk about this with all different kinds of audiences, and I can't imagine an audience where everyone's head isn't nodding. But what's the barrier to clearing this stuff?
I looked at my little book recently, and I hadn't remembered that the first sentence of the book is, "This book is a product of a failure." It's the first sentence of the book. Will I read a book that starts that way?
Not that wasn't written by a Russian author or something.
Doesn't show a lot of confidence on the part of the author, but the failure is really the answer to your question, at least the most I know, which is that when I had my previous job in the government under President Obama, I was in charge of the Paperwork Reduction Act. That was a significant part of my job, which meant that I was supposed to reduce paperwork burdens. And I kind of got very focused on it too late. And once I did, I saw in real time the forces that are behind the level of sludge that we're observing from governments, at least. And many of those forces are my sisters and brothers in the legal profession. So they're thinking we need to preserve the integrity of our program. And to do that, we need to have a lot of sludge to make sure that everyone who's getting access to the program is really entitled to access to the program. And so the lawyers are, bless them, are often the motivators of sludge. But sometimes they are mandating more sludge than the law strictly requires. And even more often than that, the lawyers often think that navigating the sludge is easy because they can do it. They wrote it after all. But if you ask someone who is, trying to get access to some permit and it's lawyer's language that they can't understand, and it's 16 questions, only 4 of which are answerable, then it's a Stephen King novel. And the lawyers didn't intend it to be a Stephen King novel. They thought it was a Dr. Seuss story, but it's a horror show. And so often it's well-motivated or risk-averse lawyers. Sometimes it's people who are okay with the fact that the program will have fewer people in it than it would otherwise do. So there might be people who don't love the program particularly, or there might be some interest group that is okay with high levels of sludge. For example, for occupational licensing, it might be that the existing people who are performing the action and making money, they don't love the idea of a lot of competition. So if occupational licensing is hard, that's completely fine by them. Simplification of tax filing. So the Department of Treasury is the Olympic gold medal winner with respect to sludge imposition in the US government. They're the Usain Bolt of sludge imposition. And it's the Internal Revenue Service that has the lion's share of what comes from the Department of Treasury. And some sludge reduction efforts have been resisted by companies that are making a lot of money from helping people get through the sludge. And if there were less sludge, then there'd be much less demand for their services because they wouldn't be needed.
Wow. There's money to be made in that sludge. That's what you're saying. There's gold in that there sludge.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. That's really interesting to think about. And I wonder too, if there's a way for us to tell whose responsibility the sludge really is. Is there a process by which you figure out who's supposed to fix this problem?
Yeah, so let's take a university. Let's name one, Yale. Students at Yale, I'm confident, have sludge that they have to deal with to be students at Yale. Now, this is not the #1 problem that America faces today, but let's work with me here. So there's students at Yale, there are administrative personnel at Yale who have to deal with sludge with respect to any number of things. There are, this is the least poignant of the 3 groups, there are faculty at Yale who have to deal with sludge. It's knowable who's responsible for the sludge. And if it's something, where people face a medical problem, let's say it's staff at Yale, and to get access to help is a sludge-full enterprise, we can find out who is responsible for it and they can reduce it. In fact, we saw with vaccination something like this, where all over the country there was sludge in terms of information you had to find, places you had to go, appointments you had to make, and it could be easy, as it is in many places now, or it could be horrible. There was a time when I was in Massachusetts and I was trying to get an appointment and I was, clicking and clicking and clicking and clicking. And there was one time where it said the waiting time was 4 hours. And I thought, that's bad, but I can just stare at my computer, I guess, for 4 hours. And then shortly it went from 4 hours to 27 hours. It says your waiting time. It actually was more specific. It said roughly 27 hours and 29 minutes. And that was part of the experience of many people trying to get vaccine appointments. Yeah. And for people trying to get help of multiple kinds, it's like that. And the people who were responsible for that took a lot of political heat, and it got better. So if we're talking about, let's say, the Department of Education in the US government, they impose a lot of sludge on students and administrators and faculty. And there are people, actual human beings who do it. My old office, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, part of its job is to reduce sludge. And the Office of Management and Budget recently had, I think, a very important document on equity, where it talked about equity of in the large. And the second finding is that administrative burdens are a source of inequity. That was the second finding.
Nice.
And there's real alertness to your point, the inequitable nature of imposition of sludge. Can be the elderly. So if you're 86 years old and you're struggling with health issues, and maybe there's cognitive decline, maybe not, the idea that you have to navigate sludge to get a little help, it's probably not the best time to impose that on people.
Yeah, serious disincentive, right? And you brought up the idea of when people were looking for vaccine information. That in itself, when you talk about paperwork or administrative burden, I think we often think of that kind of sludge is very concrete. But when I was reading your book, I was also thinking about a lot of problems that are related to misinformation itself. And I was wondering if that is also a form of sludge, sort of cognitive or psychological sludge that we have to wade through. And if it would then be subject to the same kinds of sludge busting approaches.
Great point. I hadn't thought of that. So thank you. Free associate a little. So one question is what to do with misinformation if you're, let's say, a social media provider.
Mm-hmm.
And you might have something like some social media providers have, which is in an area where there's a lot of misinformation, you might put at the top of the page for information about X, go here. Mm-hmm. And that's a little sludgy, not a lot sludgy,
yeah,
but you have to do that. Or what I think Twitter did at some points was to say, this claim is disputed. For more correct information or for another view or something, click here. There's a little sludge in that. Twitter has recently-ish had something where in order to get to retweet something, I know the jargon, I've been on Twitter more than once, in order to retweet something, they ask you, do you want to read the article first?
Yeah.
And my understanding is that that's a strategic use of sludge to prevent, let's say, sharing of misinformation. And the hope is that you'll see less retweeting of falsehood, I think, because people might click on it and think that's crazy land. I'm not going to retweet it, even though I kind of agree with it.
I would be interested to see. I don't know that I've seen any results on that yet about the effect that's had.
I have some recollection that it did reduce the amount of retweeting of falsehood, but don't take that to the bank.
Yeah, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Washington Post had a headline that in Facebook during the 2020 election, misinformation was shared 6 times more than factual information. So any gain on that would be good.
Okay, this is fantastic. So you could impose. Okay, so here's this is important. You're getting at it that sometimes sludge can serve important functions in ensuring that people are eligible for things to which they're claiming eligibility. Sometimes sludge can be like a good friction. Like there's a law that said if you buy an encyclopedia in door-to-door sales, you have a 3-day cooling off period. So you're not automatically a purchaser, and that's sludge. Here's an example that has more of an impact. There's data from Harvard's Kennedy School finding that waiting periods before people buy guns have a significant effect in reducing homicides. So a 3 to 5 day waiting period, as I recall, reduces on balance annual gun deaths by something north of 800. And that's a way of imposing sludge as a way of counteracting impulsiveness or recklessness. And you can see that online in daily stuff where it say, are you sure you want to? Which might mean delete something or make a purchase. And some of these, are you sure you want to, a little bit of sludge are self-serving. Are you sure you don't want to keep subscribing to our wonderful magazine? that would be sludge. But it could be, are you sure you don't want to stop participating in some health program where maybe people recklessly disenroll? And that can be good.
can be the good kind of sludge. And it sounds like there are a couple different kinds of sludge there. There's so time itself can be sludge, which is tricky, right? Because that feels kind of ephemeral, right? So to say 5-day waiting period, good or bad, that in itself is sludge. It's the absence of movement that is actually going to create this demotivation, in addition to just the paperwork, and the forms and the need for the proper information. And I think that it's very easy to miss time as a source of sludge, right? Because it's invisible and it comes and goes, and we don't notice the effect that it has on us.
Right, that's a great point. So one thing that the US government did when it was calculating the benefits of fuel economy mandates was to try to quantify the number of hours that people would save by not having to go to the gas station as much, and then to multiply that times a number, which would be a conservative estimate of the value of time. And it turns out that the value of fuel economy requirements is increased not trivially by the reduction of a time tax, which car ownership imposes.
Interesting, very interesting.
So to think of a time tax imposed by sludge, I think it's essential.
That's a nice way to think about it, because we know we don't get more time. We know that's the thing that's limited. So what do you think we still need to know about sludge? What are we missing about this?
Okay, there's a lot. So we need sludge audits, I think, in many places. So and the fact that we don't have them is is astonishing, I think. So I've traveled a lot before COVID, and I was very focused on sludge, and I would talk to people in governments about sludge, and I would ask them, do they know the total amount of paperwork burdens that government officials impose on the people whom they're privileged to serve? And the answer was not once, yes, we know.
Wow.
So in Germany and Denmark and Ireland and the United Kingdom and Qatar and United Arab Emirates, I was in all of those countries, and I asked people that question, and I didn't get a single yes answer. So the United States, we know there are sludge audits. No one reads the document. It's called the Misinformation Collection Budget of the United States, except internally it's known. And at times it is a motivator for making things better. In the private sector, what kind of levels of sludge companies are imposing on their employees, universities on their students, hospitals on doctors and nurses, we know much too little about that. And David Cutler, one of the best health economists in the world, wrote a paper a few years ago saying that administrative burdens in the United States are a significant part of the reason, that healthcare is so expensive in the United States. There's so much sludge and doctors and nurses and administrators, and that has real consequences for patients and the availability even of medical services. So we need much more knowledge of magnitudes. Forgive me for my excitement at your question. And the second thing we need to know is what happens when we reduce sludge? What are the actual consequences? So we have some work suggesting that if you reduce sludge with respect to, let's say, student applications to universities, you can significantly increase the number of students who aren't students with wealthy families who end up at great universities. There's some work done out of Michigan that shows sludge reduction has a big effect in getting people to go to the University of Michigan, a great university, who are not people of means. So that's a big impact. You were on the fact that sludge reduction in some places we know has a large impact. Where does it have a large impact? Then we would have evaluation, which would give us clarity about where we should generalize sludge reduction. The third thing I think that is urgent to know is your point about the distributional effects of sludge reduction and of different means of sludge reduction. So where is it that sludge reduction is done in a way that mostly benefits people who are already doing pretty well? I'm for helping people who are doing pretty well. We want to help everyone, but I'd be even more for helping people who aren't doing pretty well because they need it most.
Right.
And if you have sludge reduction in some domain that especially helps, let's say, people at the bottom of the economic ladder, or people who are unemployed, or people who are sick, or people who are old, that would be really great. And there is, there are pieces of evidence. This is why the area of behavioral science, your area, I should say that the term sludge actually came from Dr. Lamberton. She is the coiner of the term, and we are marching in her footsteps, the rest of us who use the term. Thank you, Dr. Lamberton. But the research agenda of seeing who is helped and who is hurt by elimination of paperwork requirements or waiting time, in-person interviews, by the way, to the point of time tax. And the pandemic has reduced many mandates of in-person interviews. If you think of an in-person interview for someone who, let's say, is caring for an ill parent or who has 3 kids at home, to say you have to go into this place and talk to some government official, which is maybe scary, and you don't have time to do that, you might not do it at all. And to say instead, go online and do what we're doing, that the time tax is reduced, and maybe a wall comes down. Tear down that wall.
Yeah.
Sludge creator.
And it sounds as though to get to a lot of this, we need some empathy, right? So you often find these processes are not designed at all by the people who use them. They're designed by exactly the people who don't use them, for the people who need them. So it's interesting because it pushes us to think outside our own perspective in a lot of ways. And so you brought up the fact that this book does start in classic Cass Sunstein self-effacing fashion with the idea that this came out of a failure. So 5 years from now, what we don't want you to say is, well, I wrote the book Sludge and I felt like that was kind of, now I've got to write this other book because that came out of that failure. So it sounds like what you're saying is one part of this book's success would be dependent on the proliferation of sludge audits. Is there anything else that you'd like to see that would make you feel like this book had fulfilled its mission?
Well, I'd like to see, let's say, 3 areas. Anti-poverty programs, which include job training and educational opportunities, as well as cash, having very significant reductions in sludge, such that people are getting access to them. Second, health. So areas where people get access to things that maybe would help them with something they're struggling with, or help them not get some disease or problem. It could be prevention. So for hospitals and our medical system generally to focus on sludge reduction. And the third would be discrimination. So if you think of forms of discrimination, which can include, violence of various kinds, there are remedies for that, which sometimes all over the world aren't, I'm going to use the word accessed as a whatever for the first and I hope last time in my life. They aren't accessed. I don't love that word, but they aren't made available to people because there's too much sludge. So women, as I've been working on this subject, women who are victims of domestic violence in various places have to go through a lot of sludge to get help. And that's a cruelty, and we want less of that. So to see, and at the United Nations, by the way, at the very highest levels is on the topic of sludge, being the Secretary General personally knows about this. And sludge reduction is something that I'm hoping will be part of the effort to reduce discrimination and violence of various kinds.
Great. It's really exciting. We've got a bunch of good questions, some of which I think we've sort of answered already, but I want to turn to a few of these. Here's an interesting one that's sort of asking you to talk a little bit about this balance. How do you reconcile the necessity of paperwork and red tape in propagating sludge as opposed to ensuring due process and diligence? And the example that they gave was the case of submitting qualifications for stimulus checks.
Okay, so let's take easy cases where if you reduce the amount of sludge, you lose nothing. So let's assume that there are cases where to reduce the length of the form from 7 pages to 1, nothing is compromised.
Right.
Or where you don't need to fill out the form because you know these people are eligible. That's an easy one. Okay, let's take a really hard one for sludge reduction, where the consequence of reducing sludge is you dramatically increase the number of eligible people who end up getting the benefit, when with the sludge, they wouldn't.
Right.
But you also substantially increase the number of people getting the benefit who aren't entitled to it. So the sludge reduction, let's say, increases by 100,000, I'm making up a number, the number of eligible people who finally get access to a program to which they're entitled, but you also have 100,000 people in the program who aren't entitled to it. In my view, that's a big problem. That's fraud. And I have data about what America thinks that suggests my own views are not eccentric here. You get 100,000 eligibles in, that's good, but to get 100,000 ineligibles in is really, really bad, and you don't want to do it. And now let's talk about a harder case, I think, where sludge reduction increases the number of eligibles who get it by 100,000, but increases the number of ineligibles by 200 who get it. So you reduce the sludge, hooray, lots of eligibles are getting the thing, but some number, it's not, 2, it's a couple hundred are getting the benefit who wouldn't otherwise get the benefit. My data suggests that across political lines, Americans at least are good with that.
Yeah.
The strong majorities are good with that. If the number of eligibles who get in is much, much, much higher than the number of ineligibles who get in, they think that's an okay price to pay. Now, from the government's point of view, it's a little more complicated because it might be that the law flatly bans you from doing something that even allows 200 people to get in who aren't. So there may be some legal constraint, but maybe there isn't. Maybe the law allows you to err a little bit if that's the price for not erring a lot on the other side. And so the answer to the question is there are a bunch of cases where we can costlessly cut sludge significantly. There are a bunch of cases where cutting sludge is just too costly because it ensures high levels of fraud. And there are other cases that are hard, and how hard they are probably depends on the numbers.
Yeah. It sounds as though even if we just started with easy cases, we'd have plenty of work to do, right?
Completely.
Actually, quite a lot of opportunity there. I thought that there's a question that is specifically relevant to your role right now. Someone asked, can you talk a bit about the sludge that the Department of Homeland Security deals with? And they specifically say there's lots of misinformation about what's necessary sludge when it comes to refugees and immigrants. I wonder if you have any information you can share from that. And the answer is, if the answer is no, that's okay.
I love the phrasing, can I talk about it? And I'm here in my personal capacity, not in my government capacity. So I would refer you to the Public Affairs Office.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Someone also asked about whether sludge itself can constitute a nudge. And I think we talked about that a little bit, right? It can be used to shape someone's behavior. Do you have a sense of whether people would respond differently to a sludge-based nudge as opposed to a more straightforward, say, social norms nudge?
It depends on the context, I think. So there's actually a lot of data, not enough, but a lot of data about what people think of nudges. And one way to summarize the data is that if people think nudges are promoting a goal which they like, then they are enthusiastic about nudges. If they think nudges are not supporting a goal that they like, then they're against them. And so if you have sludge, did I lose you, by the way? You still there?
Hi, Professor Lambert.
Hi,
We lost
hi.
Professor Sunstein from the call, I think. So just give me a second to get in touch with him.
Okay, sorry. I'm so I think that my internet disconnected.
Oh, no.
Oh, I'm back.
We're back. Sorry about that.
Sorry to have been lost, but maybe that introduced a little. They sometimes think in communication, if you introduce like something unexpected or sudden, then people pay attention more closely. So I'm sure you all were paying attention closely anyhow. Thank you for hanging with us. The basic idea is the literature on nudging suggests if people like the goal towards which people are being nudged, they tend to like the nudge. So if people are being nudged to stop smoking, or if they're being nudged to avoid high calorie food, most people tend to like that. If people are being nudged in a direction they don't like, then people tend not to like that so much. So sludge reduction, casual empiricism, let's call it, which is to say no data, tends to be very, very popular because the notion of burdensome paperwork requirements and waiting times and so forth, people really don't like that generally. You have to work a little bit to find an area where people think it's a good idea. Gun purchases is one. For many people, getting an abortion is another. Many Americans think that sludge before women get abortion is a good idea. Many don't. It turns very much on the substantive area.
Yes. Mm.
Sludge. Many people don't like voting sludge. Some people do. And so the interaction between constitutional rights and sludge is a really interesting area. Sludge that people have to wade through before they express themselves, that violates the Constitution. And people are generally pretty glad about that. The fact that people are so divided with respect to voting sludge and abortion sludge, I think is keenly interesting. And basically, that's the heart of the answer to this great question.
Well, that's really interesting because it sounds as though what you're saying is we may be able to understand people's implicit biases in a sense by looking at their sludge tolerance, whether it's implicit or explicit. Higher levels of tolerance for sludge tell you something about where they stand with regard to the value they place in a given right or ability.
That's so interesting. So completely, where voting sludge makes some people, including me, I confess, see red, whereas other people think, that's a way of ensuring integrity in our system. And there can be reasonable arguments there. But there's something else I think in your question, which is the intensity of people's opposition to sludge in general probably is diverse across people. So no one loves it, but some people particularly despise it in general. I know that to be a referee for an academic paper for some journals, this will not make most of you get really emotional with outrage, but for many, it is a arduous process to register to be a referee. And for some of my friends in academic life, that is like an outrage. They say, I'm not going to referee the paper because there's too much sludge before I start.
It's great. Yeah, it's very easy to be dissuaded about doing something you didn't really want to do anyway. That sludge becomes really unacceptable. Well, I wanted to tie this up by asking one of the questions, was actually one of the first ones that came up in the Q&A. And it was, is there anything that you couldn't fit in this book about sludge that you really wanted to? And if there's a next book coming out that picks up on this, where do you think you'd head with this next?
Well, I kept it really short, partly because I thought it would be ironic in a bad way if it was like packed stuff. But there are so many things I was curious about. I think it's urgent to know that the book couldn't get into. So the real world of sludge, I think, is the name of one of the chapters, and it's really risk. So that chapter could be a whole book on what is sludge that's experienced by people who are trying to, get educational opportunities in Nevada. What's that? What are various differences across states? What bright spots are there? Are there states that have been real sludge busters? What about companies in business? I'm really interested in this. Apple, with respect to many of its products, the sludge for users is really slow. Steve Jobs was kind of an intuitive anti-sludge genius. There's a book on website design which it has the title "Don't Make Me Think." Basically, a seamless experience where using a website, if it's designed well, there's no sludge. And there's just a lot conceptually and empirically that I don't know, and that I hope we will learn.
Yeah, and I suppose I know we're sort of getting toward the end of our time, but somebody did raise this question of technology. And I think it's a good question to say, what can technology do for us in this way? Do you think that there's a way that, for example, using our cell phones and the apps that we have downloaded can allow us to more easily access government programs or provide information that we need to use or that we need to provide?
Absolutely. So there are apps. I have Mobile Passport, which is a cousin of TSA Pre and Global Entry, and it's an app. And so in the days when I used to travel internationally, the fact there's a mobile passport on my phone, that's a great sludge buster. And mobile passport, it's a Zoom. You land, you're tired, and you're basically through really quickly. We need much more of that. So switching from paper and in person to remote and online and through an app, this is a great thing. And the US government has done a bunch of this, and we should expect more. The downside is that online, there's awareness that if you impose a little bit of sludge, you can maybe make a lot of money. And so to make it so that enrollment is easy and disenrollment is hard, it's sometimes described as a dark pattern. And there are others that manipulate attention so that you have to wade through sludge to attend to something in an agreement you're making. And that's a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think somebody had a question about this. There's a sense that perhaps sludge should only be antiquated, right? That we should be moving toward a more sludge-free world. But the person asked this question, is that the case? Is most of the sludge just due to outdated procedures and paperwork, or are we seeing the same level of sludge in new policies and new developments?
Well, you can think of some area, choose your constitutional right, where the level of sludge in some place has grown over the last period. It might be okay, it might be a good thing, but still, and for certain services online, some aspect of it is sludgeful, where if the aspect is only getting access to some information that's essential, but hard because of sludge. So there's a great paper on information overload and manipulation, where a lot of sludge in the form of lots and lots of words can be a way of manipulating people not to understand what they're getting themselves into.
Yeah, very interesting. I think we can all think of advertisements that do exactly that. Don't look at the shiny thing, look at all these words, right? It's wonderful. Well, I think we're getting to the end of our time. That's the cue that I'm getting, but I wanted to just say, is there anything you'd like to leave us with as far as sludge goes? Something you'd like all of us to do?
Yes, within the next week, can everyone who's on this call either reduce sludge in some non-trivial way in their own personal or professional life, or work in an organization to get it to reduce the unjustified sludge that it imposes on you and other people? Can we all make a commitment to do that within the next week?
I'm on board.
I'm going to do it. I'm signing up to my own endeavor.
I think we can use one of those pre-commitment nudges on this one. Absolutely. If you're here, you're on board. But that's great. Well, thank you so much. Always a delight to get to talk with you, Professor Sunstein. I think we toss it back to the Harvard Bookstore to tie us up.
Thank you, Cait. Great pleasure.
Yes, thank you both. Thanks to Professor Sunstein and Professor Lamberton. Thank you, all of you out there, for spending your Friday evening with us. You can learn more about this important book and purchase Sludge on harvard.com and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Have a good night. Keep reading, and everyone, please, please be well. Thank you both very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.